Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we want to thank you all for tuning in. Today on The Voice of Yoga, we will talk about an idea of the divine purpose as the universal reason for existence, an archetypal theme for every human to be whole. Listen as we discuss John 4:24. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. In this show, we will compare the effects of modern technology on the human experience, which may be keeping humanity in a subhuman standard. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and worship in spirit and truth. So I see the title of today's show is Expressing the Divine Purpose. Let's break that down for our listeners.
Yeah, we've always talked about the idea of a purpose. And we talk about it as, like we said in the opening, that it is a central theme. It is a universal archetype that we all want to be whole. We want to be complete. And one of the things that we always say is completion can't happen on the physical level. And the major reason is nothing manifests whole. And this is why we had to learn how to go through form the physical. And more you start to see that this is exactly what Mary Baker Eddy is talking about in her discovery. And she does it in a little different way, but she talks about accepting ourselves to be spiritual. Because spirit is whole, it's complete. But we also have to understand this process of the human becoming divine is also an essential component to this. We have to go through these points of passage and assisted by rites of passage, which is what is missing in our civilization today.
I'd like to talk more about the divine purpose. I know that's something that we all struggle with, like why are we here? Is this why we have problems in our material world because we're trying to figure out what it is that we're supposed to be doing?
Well, I think for a lot of us, that's exactly what it is, but it's more complicated than that because most of our problems come from the simple fact we do not know ourselves aright. We don't know the truth of being, which is life is perfect. It's whole, it's complete, it's eternal, changeless. And we're identifying with this false sense of self. And in yoga, we call that the cycle of death and rebirth. And as long as we are in belief that we are a finite mortal being, then we're under the law of karma. And material law is the law of reciprocity. For every action, there is an equal and an opposite reaction. What we put out is what we get back. Karma is the perfect accountant, and it keeps record of everything that we do. And as long as we are in the illusion of time under the law of karma, then we can have good times, but then they're always shadowed by bad times, because that's the nature of the beast. There is an action with an equal opposite reaction that's attached to it, and it's driven by a belief in two powers. And the idea of liberation for the human is found in rising above the law of karma. And it's really the only way we can find real solution to what it is we struggle with.
So I understand now that our purpose is to glorify God, glorify the Creator. But as I'm understanding also is that is easier said than done.
Right, because as John said in 4:24, God is a spirit, and they who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And so you really see that this idea of becoming whole, becoming spirit, is really found in accepting the simple fact that there is only one life without opposite. And this one life is perfect. And as long as we are in material identity, as long as we accept that we're a separate entity, we're the prodigal, we're out of the Father's house, we're not under the protection of the divine law, and we're under the jurisdiction of the law of karma, driven by this belief in two powers. And what we're working with is the understanding that you don't just do this academically. You don't declare yourself to be spirit. There's a process. There's the separation, the journey, the return. We must become spiritual, not to the extent that we convert this mortal sense of self, but we do it by dissolving the false sense of self, which is really a hypnotic state. We believe we are born in a physical body. And we have to come out of the belief. We awaken into the truth. The divine creation is right here, it's right now, and it's functioning.
What are some of the strategies that we could employ to awaken to this truth?
Well, I really have resolved myself to see that this process in development is really the route to take, because in order to do it, you need a path of action, you need a path of knowledge, you need a path of devotion. Now, I am sure that you can do this if you are in the presence of someone who has this level of consciousness, the realization of the one perfect divine life in consciousness. Someone who is demonstrating divine law with scientific certainty. Because as Jesus says, and I, if I be lifted up, I draw all men unto me. And so that is possible. But for most of us, like we're trying to do this from a book. And I really like what Mary Baker Eddy tells us in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures on page 114, 115, and I'll read it. In divine science, the universe, including man, is spiritual, harmonious, and eternal. Science shows that what is termed matter is but the subjective state of what is termed by the author mortal mind. Apart from the usual opposition to everything new, the one great obstacle to the reception of that spirituality through which the understanding of mind science comes is the inadequacy of material terms for metaphysical statements and the consequent difficulty of so expressing metaphysical ideas as to make them comprehensible to any reader who has not personally demonstrated Christian science as brought forth in my discovery. End of quote. And so you can see the complications we have when we're trying to do this, when you don't have the experience of divine truth in consciousness. What's that going to look like if I can do it, when I can do it? And that's why I think Mary Baker Eddy put healing on the table. Because if you have truth and consciousness, then you have the mind of Christ, which heals the sick, reforms sinner, raises the dead. And what we find is that we're trying to do this with the mortal mind, the mind that can't bring forth the divine image. The concept of blindness in the Bible is there to explain. With the corporeal senses, we see what isn't there and are blind to what is there, which is the divine creation, the spiritual fact, the Word of God pouring forth the perfection of being. However we say it, the divine principle of the spiritual universe is here, it's now, and functioning. The pool of Siloam is the conscious awareness of the divine principle, which washes away the false universal belief in mortality and its limiting human conditions.
Swami, could you explain further about this pool of Siloam?
Yeah, the pool of Siloam, this is referred to in the Bible where Jesus does a healing of a blind man outside of Jerusalem. And I really recommend, if you can, that you go to Herb Fitch's Realization of Oneness, where he explains the meaning behind the 4 blind healings in the Bible. And he unboxes it really well. But the washing in the pool of Siloam, which means sent, and Jesus says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Jesus says, my doctrine is not my own, but he who sent me. The pool of Siloam isn't the creek over there which the human sees with the mortal eyes, and what seems to be what the blind man finds to wash the mud off of his eyes. He washes in the upper waters of the spiritual universe, which is omnipresent. And so more and more you start to see that we're trying to understand something that is spiritual, whole, complete, absolute in rational terms. We're trying to understand it with the mind that can't bring forth the divine image. And this is one of the reasons why we've been really focusing on the idea of stopping thinking, forming thoughts and opinions based on information coming through the material senses, which is actually creating that which we see that isn't there. And it produces a veil, and it prevents us from seeing what is there. And once we stop thinking with our material senses, and we watch, we wait, we listen, we let divine truth begin to reveal itself to us in silence and in stillness. Divine mind, which is pure consciousness, it's right here, it's right now, and it's looking for its counterpart in individual consciousness. So if we're thinking, we are creating an interference pattern with the divine idea. But in silence and in stillness, we match it. And like attracts like. So this invites the divine idea into human consciousness. And we need to practice this. And a big part of this practice is this process that we're talking about, because collectively we are remaining in this underdeveloped state. We never separate the mind from the influence of the material senses, which then keeps us stuck in the cycle of death and rebirth.
So how do we know when we are successful in making this separation?
Yeah, I like the imagery that they use in mythology, the idea of the boy married to mother, which most of us think, well, I left home years ago. But we're not talking about your actual parent here. We're talking about instinct, appetite, preservation, survival. We're talking about this original state of consciousness. And when we're stuck in addictive, compulsive behavior, emotionality, violence, this is what mythology is talking about. And even in her book, Mary Baker Eddy, on page 115, she talks about the scientific translation of mortal mind. First degree depravity, physical, evil beliefs, passions and appetites, fear, depraved will, self-justification, pride, envy, deceit, hatred, revenge, sin, sickness, disease, death. And the marginal heading is unreality. So this is what we're talking about. This is what we must graduate from. She goes into, on that same page, the second degree, evil beliefs disappearing, moral, humanity, honesty, affection, compassion, hope, faith, meekness, temperance, with a marginal heading of traditional qualities. Now, of course, the next stage in human development, where we go from this larvae state where we're careless, emotional, excitable, indulgent, we graduate to the next phase, which is where we are intelligent, ambitious, abstinent. But by the same token, we're struggling with the things that we were craving in the larvae state. The pull back to this regressive cycle is very strong. And this is why we have to develop our psychological organs, and we have to develop the ability to make intelligent decisions based on the values that are in accordance with universal order.
Well, we're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor. So listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Asana class is a module fitting into the master plan, leading the practitioner to the experience of total consciousness by attuning the mind-body complex to the divine idea. A system of exercises designed to use the physical appearance to determine individual level of consciousness and degree of awareness, starting with the process of lengthening and strengthening muscles to bring bones into the position of internal support. We educate thought up to spiritual apprehension, because when spirit is cause, it calls into expression the beauty of holiness, making creation perfect. Mountain pose may not bring you truth in consciousness, but truth in consciousness must bring mountain pose. Visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. Swami, I'd like to get back to talking about our purpose and glorifying the Creator. What more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, the purpose of life is to glorify the Creator. Now, the collective consensus today sends the human out in search of my purpose, because we believe this concept of God makes us to do His work. And this misunderstanding of life and misunderstanding of what the Creator is keeps the human in the false belief of a life apart from the divine creation and lost in the never-ending search to find how the unreal became real. We do this because we don't live in the divine creation. We live outside the Father's house, with limited resources, or the branch cut off from the vine withering in time. And this is 180 degrees from what John is telling us. We must worship in spirit and in truth. That a human being really doesn't have anything to offer the Creator, because there is no human being. It's simply a hypnotic state. It is an image, a thought about what's really here. And so when we accept spiritual identity, we come out of the belief in being separate from the one perfect divine life. And as Jesus says, I and the Father are one. In spiritual truth, there's only one life, and it's indivisible. It's whole, it's complete, it's everywhere now. And this is why in the Bible it says, ask in my name, ask in my likeness. When you are in spiritual identity, you are one with the divine creative principle. And all that the divine creative principle is what you are. So there are no needs. Spirit isn't looking for anything. It's completely fulfilled. And when you are in my name, you're in my likeness. So it's almost like a trick question. Because the only way that you can have a need or even a want is if you are out of the Father's house, if you are not conscious of the truth of your being, which is perfect.
And so when we become this truth of being, when we're conscious of that, this is when the healing takes place, like what Jesus was able to do and show us?
Yeah, the origins of the word heal means to be whole. And all of the healings in the Bible that Jesus does are just simply revealings of the truth. He's breaking the hypnotic state of someone who thinks they are a finite mortal being with a condition and awaken them into the truth, the divine creation, which is right here and right now. And that's one of the reasons why after a certain number of his miracles, he really tells them, you're well now, stop sinning. Sinning here isn't really regulating your behavior based on rules and regulations. It's not about moral conduct. Sinning here is believing in the mortal sense of life. And so if life is purely spiritual, what is it that seems to live and die? And I have something here that Mary Baker Eddy wrote in a letter to Calvin Fry about a man with a leg disease. And I'll read it. I knew that if he died, he would awake to find that he had not that disease. And I wanted to wake him to it before he died. End of quote. Mary Baker Eddy understood that the mortal mind, the nature of the mortal mind was purely hypnotic, and that what seemed to be matter pointed to this divine creation. But it's the mortal mind that brings forth the counterfeit, the false sense of life. And so the question that we've been working with is, can the mind free itself from its own creation? And this is what we mean when we say we stop thinking, we stop forming thoughts and opinions based on the information that we're getting through the material senses so that we can start to awaken to the presence of the divine creation by activating our 7 spiritual senses.
When Mary Baker Eddy says that she wanted to wake him to it before he died, that reminds me that must have been what Jesus did, is that he woke them to their spiritual self and therefore they were healed. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. All healings are the revealing of the divine truth. The divine truth is the only thing that is real. It's the only self-existent power in the universe. This mental material concept is provisional. This is part of what Mary Baker Eddy called the changing conditions of the personal mentality. And we have to put this off in order to be receptive to the deeper things of the creative principle, which is the divine creation.
Getting back to the John verse 4:24, how do we know that we're worshiping God in spirit and in truth?
Yeah, Jesus came to fulfill the law of Moses, which he explained to the Pharisees. They didn't obey. They didn't understand this idea of spiritual circumcision, this idea of the Christ, the saving aspect of truth. That divine truth in consciousness heals the sick, reforms sinner, raises the dead. And we talk about spiritual identity without understanding the difference between the subhuman identity and the human identity. And it's very easy to mistake the false for the real. And we do that. Most of us think that, when we're instinctual, we're emotional, we're reactive, we're under the influence of world thought, that we're human. And that's actually a subhuman level of consciousness. It's really not until we reach that moral state where we're regulating our behavior based on the precepts and the laws of the creative principle that we're human. And then we're so far removed from what it is to be spiritual, to be whole, complete, fulfilled, eternal, changeless. And this is what they call the vidya in Kriya Yoga, mistaking the impermanent for the permanent, the false for the real. And then if you don't have a way of checking and testing what you're doing, then you just continue making the same silly mistakes. It's insanity, doing the same thing, expecting a different return.
We have a quote here from Mary Baker Eddy that really shows how prophetic she was.
Yeah, this is from Science and Health, page 197, and it's lines 10 to 12. And I'll read it. God said of the tree of knowledge, which bears the fruit of sin, disease, and death, in the day that thou eatst thereof, thou shalt surely die. The less that is said of physical structure and laws, and the more that is thought and said about moral and spiritual law, the higher will be the standard of living, and the farther mortals will be removed from imbecility or disease. End of quote. Yeah, and for me, I can really see how humanity has spiraled downwards and backwards from the time that Mary Baker Eddy was on the planet. And there's really no surprise why you're hard-pressed to find anybody that's demonstrating this discovery that she made. Because for the most part, we don't understand what she's saying. And the other thing is, we're removed from the process. Our lifestyle today doesn't enable us to separate from the false sense of self. And we do everything that we can to try and figure out how the unreal became real when, like she says, we need to give ourselves this half a turn. We have to come out of the belief in a physical, mortal sense of life and know the truth. Life is perfect, whole, complete, right here, right now. But we must be conscious of it in order to activate it in our experience.
And only then we'll be able to worship in spirit and truth.
Right, because if you're not in spiritual identity, then you're in that mortal sense of self, which God did not create.
Well, we are going to close down our show for today, so listeners, be sure to visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. On the homepage, and you see the fading banner, Blog Talk Radio, click it, directs you to its catalog page. Click the Products tab, Online Classes, directs you to all the classes that Swami has available. Swami, any final thoughts about today's show?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and worship in spirit and truth. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton along with Swami Jayananda signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.